Our first lesson this morning is Psalm 100, a song of praise for the Lord's faithfulness to his people. Make a joyful shout to the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Be thankful to him, and bless his name. For the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endures to all generations. And our second reading this morning comes from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 1 through 16. By faith we understand. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he, being dead, still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken away, so that he did not see death, and was not found, because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had his testimony that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And by faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they have called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. In the last couple of weeks, there has been this new feature that has become particularly popular on Facebook, that generates a picture from a photo that was taken and uploaded 10 years ago. The picture that searched in my archives from my account on Facebook was from Thanksgiving, from a decade ago, when I was at ground zero of the Thanksgiving experience. It was 10 years ago, this upcoming holiday, that I was at Plymouth Rock on Thanksgiving weekend. It certainly was a fascinating place to visit Plymouth Plantation and see where such important history took place for our country. Now, for the people of the United States of America, the story of the arrival of the Pilgrims to Plymouth in the year 1620 is in many ways one of the beginning accounts of our country. The significance in the signing of the Mayflower Compact was a beginning step for creating democracy, where wealth was no longer a measuring point for participation in deciding affairs, that all men could participate, not only rich landowning folks who had a voice. Now, of course, we know that the indigenous people had lived on this continent for millennia with developed cultures and customs. And as you know the story of Thanksgiving well enough, if it had not been for the native people, the Plymouth colony would have perished from starvation. It is the legacy of the Pilgrims that captivates the attention of the American Christian mind at this time of year. After the world-changing history of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, the lives of the Pilgrims are probably the second most important narrative of Christians in this nation, apart from the scriptures and the stories there themselves. The story of the Pilgrims is probably better known even than any story of the Bible in our country. Now, those who are best remembered as passengers on the Mayflower are names like Miles Standish, William Brewster, John Alden, William Bradford, Priscilla Mullins, among others. However, there's a much lesser-known figure who was responsible for the Pilgrims to set sail on the Mayflower in the first place. And this almost forgotten figure in history was a man named Thomas Weston. 5 years before the Pilgrims ever set sail, Weston had established some type of business relationship with the Pilgrims back in England. By 1615, he had made arrangements for some of the Pilgrims' products that had been manufactured to be sent to the Netherlands for sale. Now, Weston was not one of the Pilgrims' church community. He was not one that wanted to separate from the Church of England like the Pilgrims did. Weston instead was a leader of a stock company who financed the passage of the Mayflower across the Atlantic to Plymouth Rock. Weston did not finance the Pilgrims because he was sympathetic to their theological concerns. He invested in them because they were a promising business venture. See, Weston belonged to an entrepreneurial company known as the Merchant Adventurers, who sought to make money in North America. And so to pay for their voyage across the sea, the Pilgrims agreed to supply the merchant adventurers with furs and other natural resources and raw materials once they had settled themselves in the New World. Now, Weston was the one who organized a crew to go with the Pilgrims across the ocean. Just as Weston was not particularly interested in their concerns for what kind of church they wanted to have as Pilgrims, Weston hired a crew that also were not part of the Pilgrim church. The Pilgrims themselves, who were willing to travel to the New World to take that risk, were a small band. And so about half of those who sailed with the Pilgrims in the Mayflower were not part of their church. They were people who were hired on, military folks, a physician or a medic at least anyway, other people who were needed to make the operation go. And of the Pilgrims, some of them who traveled were past their prime in age and strength, and there were workers who were needed to go along with the colony simply for the necessity of needing people who with strength who could lift heavy logs and do other kinds of manual labor. Now, as you may remember, the Pilgrims experienced a terrible journey across the Atlantic. They had embarked on their journey late in the season and ran off course and ended up arriving in present-day Massachusetts instead of New York, where they had originally hoped to land. And because their journey had been much longer and more crowded than they had anticipated, their provisions were scarce and disease began to overtake them. After finally being able to secure a settlement, the lack of food brought the death of exactly half of their colony through the winter of 1621. And their situation became so desperate that they had to bury their dead at night for fear to not reveal how weak their community had become. There were so many who were sick that there were hardly any left to take care of those who needed care. So after having survived with the God-given help of the Pokanoket Nation, the rugged half of the community who had made it through the first year and had celebrated a successful harvest, comes our American Thanksgiving celebration. In the year that they had been in the New World, they had managed to build a few shelters. They had managed to put in a bit of a crop, but it was really the Native Americans under Squanto who had taught them how to, the best places to fish, how to plant the corn in this kind of climate. And so the Pilgrims in the Plymouth colony had little time to think about paying back their debts that they had incurred to Mr. Weston and his merchant adventures. In the next year, not so long after the Harvest Festival in the winter, Weston sent over a ship to be filled with goods to bring back to England as payment for their passage. But the ship that came to the Pilgrims, that ship did not arrive empty to them. Aboard that vessel to Plymouth came 37 more colonists to join the community, which was unknown to them. Now, in one sense, the Pilgrims were glad to receive these new people who contributed their individual talents and abilities, and especially the refreshed manpower that was needed to do the heavy grunt work. But at the same time, the surprise arrival of 37 people to the 52 who had survived the first winter seriously stressed the food rations for the folks. And Governor Bradford decided to cut each person's ration in half. Even at this drastic step, the governor estimated that their food supply would be dangerously low by the end of the winter. The Pilgrims saw their strength in being a like-minded community of believers. And that's why they had endeavored to come and made a compact to come in the first place. But you remember from your history classes that the strangers, the ones who have been hired on, that they had to agree all together what kind of government they were going to have. It would be chaos. There would be no responsibility and an order if each person was allowed to go on his or her own. And so this morning we think of that Mayflower Compact that was a beginning piece, a little seed to our American constitutional government. While the Pilgrims and the strangers were successful in that first year, by God's help, they had nothing really to send to Weston in payment. They were empty-handed. They had eked out survival, and the only thing that they could think of to send back to England on that ship were heavy rocks to use for construction, for a foundation. And the governor of the Plymouth colony, William Bradford, sent an apologetic note detailing their many hardships that they had suffered over the year. But nonetheless, Weston, the businessman that he was profoundly disappointed in having only received rocks when he expected gold and furs. Weston had his bills to pay as well. And so after only receiving a shipment of rocks, Thomas Weston was understandably disappointed for not receiving anything all that great to sell. So in the following year, on a ship named the Fortune, Weston sent 30 more people to come to the colony, but not to join the Plymouth colony, but to form a new colony close to Plymouth that would be more focused on actually making a profit and not as focused on sustaining a community. That settlement came, but then also, too, in that next year that followed, and the Pilgrims had a little bit more to work with, when they finally were able to spare a little bit of their goods and had time and energy to catch some furs, they sent it back with Weston, this time when that second fleet had come, for those who were going to establish the second colony. They actually had some things to put on the boat this time, but as that vessel was sailing back to England, it got off course and sailed to France instead, and French military or pirates or whatever stole the goods off that ship, and so the Pilgrims became even further indebted and were not able to pay their bills that year. So Weston had had enough, and so he had sent this colony, figuring in firsthand that this was going to happen anyway, that they would not pay enough of their bill. And so it was about 15 miles away they started the second settlement. But the second settlement was in a place called Wessagusset. And it never really took off the way that it should. It got off on the wrong foot from the beginning. See, unlike the Pilgrims, who were mostly family folks, this crew who had come to start the second colony were young single men. And so they were not as restrained in their behaviors. And they didn't take orders as well as, and it wasn't as orderly as the Plymouth colony was. And they prioritized building houses for themselves, knowing that the winter was coming, but neglected to plant a crop for the season. They were correct in rightly fearing the snow, but they did not have enough food to eat. And so they became desperate, and in their desperation they stole from the natives, they begged for food from the Plymouth colony, and some abandoned Wessagusset and went back to Plymouth to stay. And a few actually did starve to death, or some others indentured themselves to serve as laborers for the Indians. So it was not surprising that Wessagusset failed after only 1 year in operation. Now, while the natives were waiting for late winter when the colonists would be at their weakness in Wessagusset, they had been observing that colony, whom they didn't like because the colonists had stolen their food. The head of the Pokanoket Nation, Wessagusset, lay sick, and he was dying of typhus. His tongue had become so inflamed that he wasn't able to swallow anymore and wasn't able to receive nourishment, and his eyesight had gone because of this. Now, one of the pilgrims, named Edward Winslow, who served as the medic for the colony, traveled to Wessagusset with some rudimentary medicines to treat the chief. And besides administering the elixir, Winslow scraped the infection off the Wessagusset's tongue, and shortly afterwards he was able to eat some broth and quickly recovered, gaining his eyesight back in only 20 minutes or something like that. And the chief, of course, was extremely grateful to Edward Winslow for returning his body to health, that he informed the pilgrims and the people at Wessagusset, by extension, of some very important news. Because the people at the second colony, Wessagusset, had stolen from the natives, all the other natives had joined in a confederacy and were planning, when the settlers would be at their weakest in the winter, when the food supply was low, that they were going to attack them and get rid of both colonies. But in gratefulness for Winslow's medical work, Wessagusset informed them. So when Edwin Winslow returned to the community, he informed them of their plans. And right away, Governor Bradley wanted to prevent that there would be chaos in the community. And so he urged caution at the people of Plymouth to not do anything too rash. But the Pilgrims' hired military leader, Miles Standish, maintained that if the natives were able to band together, put aside their differences, and to attack the two colonies, that the Pilgrims and the Wessagusset folks would be greatly outnumbered, and there would be no hope for them to survive. The only thing that he believed that would keep them safe was to discourage them from ever partaking of this attack in the first place. Strike first and intimidate the natives not to mess with the English. So Standish and a crew traveled to Wessagusset to provide military assistance. And when the rival native Wessagusset discovered that Standish and company had come to Wessagusset, they also left their village to come to Wessagusset to see what Standish and the other folks were up to. And so to defeat the Wessagusset enemies, that was the name of the people who were planning the attack, Standish and his military men brought pork with them, which they knew the Wessagusset did not have and would likely be weak to resist the smell. And so they invited them into one of those houses that had been built at Wessagusset to cook the meal, and at a certain point Standish gave the sign to attack, and he grabbed a knife that was on that Wessagusset leader's neck and stabbed him with it. And the other men who were with Standish also did their part to overtake those who were plotting to overtake them first. Now, because of this military campaign, The English were spared from any immediate attack, but it heightened suspicion between the groups, and it made trade more difficult between them. And furthermore, the head pilgrim pastor back in Leiden in the Netherlands, who had not come to the New World yet, severely criticized Miles Standish for preempting, for making the first step in trying to save their lives. This preemptive strike saved both the Plymouth colony and the Wessagusset colony, as weak as it already was from starving and not really having that great of a food source. But it made the people scared, and so by taking out the natives at Wessagusset, the Wessagusset community continued to decline, and by the year 1623, it had been abandoned. And then another fellow by the name of Robert Gorges came to start another colony at Wessagusset again. The land had been cleared, and so he figured, well, if we organize this a little bit better this time around, we're going to make a success of it. And to give the place a new life and a new identity, he changed the name from Wessagusset to Weymouth. But the change in name did not yield a better outcome. By the time the colony had failed a second time, Gorges had already abandoned the community by then. So this was the first attempted settlement in New England by the English after the Plymouth colony. Now, there was a second attempt to form a settlement, and this one was by a man named Thomas Morton. Now, Thomas Morton had known this Gorges family, or Georges, however it's pronounced, I can't remember, back in England. And so he had ties, and he had come to the Plymouth colony and had seen what life was like there. And he did not care for their rules and their regulations. He wanted a much more free kind of life that wasn't governed by strict Sunday observation and church attendance and all these things. So Morton came and founded a settlement that was named Marymount. Now, Morton had come from a part of England in the west known as Devonshire that was known to carry on many traditions from the old days of paganism. The fact that Morton was proud of his Devonshire heritage already made him suspect in the eyes of the pilgrims. Now, in contrast to the Plymouth and its strict rules and serious religious life, Morton encouraged the settlers to engage in Roman pagan-like festivals and ordered the construction of a maypole under which exotic dancing took place with generous amounts of alcohol consumed. Because of the loose morality and exuberant festivities, the Marymount colony attracted more settlers, and traders, and commercial life grew at Marymount than at Plymouth because it was the quote-unquote more fun colony. However, the economic success of Marymount eventually led to the expulsion of its leader, Thomas Morton. Part of the economic success of Marymount and Thomas Morton's work there was how the colony sold guns to the enemy tribes of the Pokanoket and the Pilgrims. Now here again, Miles Standish led a military brigade out of Plymouth up to Marymount during one of their festivals of debauchery. And those who attempted to guard the colony from this attack sequestered themselves into a small space, and Standish and the others attacked them in their moment of weakness. And when ambushed at short range, Morton brandished his gun at Standish, but was too intoxicated that he did not possess the wherewithal to discharge his weapon, and Standish wrested the gun from him. And of course, the other defenders of Marymount were also too affected by inebriation and were easily overpowered. And so Morton was arrested. And if the Pilgrims would have had their way, they would have executed him likely. But he was too well connected in the old country that they figured that they couldn't get away with it and simply abandoned him to an island where he would have to wait for a ship from England to come in next time around to have passage back to Europe. The natives there felt sorry for him because he had sold them weapons, and so they provided him with some food, and he did live. Now, in the scope of the history of the original settlements of the English in Massachusetts, only one was a success to be remembered. The one that we remember at this time of the year with feasting and with prayers of thanksgiving to God, while the other attempts of Wessagusset and Weymouth and Marymount, they are only obscure footnotes in American history. Why is it the case that thousands continue to visit Plymouth Rock and the colony each year, but Wessagusset and Marymount are nothing? For the Pilgrims and the strangers of Plymouth, they were the first to settle, and that is part of the reason that we remember them more than these other groups, was that they had the pride of place of being first. But the religious convictions of Plymouth on the one side, and those of all these other colonies who sought to compete with Plymouth, the contrast between them was quite sharp. Now, the Pilgrims and the strangers were generally wise in their dealings with the indigenous people. The Plymouth colony would have certainly perished if it had not been for the help of Squanto in showing them how to fish and how to plant crops. And if Edward Winslow had not traveled to treat and use that scarce amount of medicine that they had to give it to Massasoit, they would have never found out about that plot that the natives had to take out both of their communities. Both the Pokanoket and the Pilgrims were smart enough to realize that the presence of the other benefited each group. While the Pilgrims probably needed the Pokanoket more than the other way around, the Pokanoket came to understand that the Pilgrims, with their superior technology and gunfire, it was good to have them on their side against the Pokanoket's other enemies. But there was something more than just a military alliance that was appealing and that we respect when we think of the story of the Pilgrims. We think of Samoset, the first Pokanoket fellow who simply just walked in to the Plymouth colony. He knew a little bit of English, and so he greeted them with a hello and a good day. Now that would take a lot of guts to be able to do something like that when he would have not known what kind of response they would give. There was something about the Pilgrims and the strangers that the natives felt comfortable working with. And besides their religious commitment, the Pilgrims were people who were successful with God's help and the help of the natives because the Pilgrims maintained a balanced schedule. They worked hard, they prayed hard, and they zealously guarded the Lord's Day as a day of rest as much as possible. They understood that the rhythm of a rigorous week and day set aside for corporate worship and time to be with family, that both hard work and time with family are necessary for harmony and stability. While their Sundays were very controlled, the Pilgrims were not people who placed much emphasis on the scheduled holidays of the year. This wasn't their style. And so when some of the strangers wanted to take Christmas Day off, the Pilgrims' families, okay, fine, you can have Christmas Day off and you don't have to work, and we'll just go to work and you just have fun for the day. But when the Pilgrims returned from their day of work and they saw the strangers playing some type of game that was making a lot of noise, they shut it down completely. So, I mean, they were a strict group, and I don't know if any of us would really wanted to have been under those kind of rules as well. But it served them successfully in their condition. They were keenly aware of how tenuous their situation was. During their first year of planting, some of their varieties of seeds were so scarce, they maybe only had just a little tiny bit, that they had to constantly guard 24 hours a day their crops. And if, a mouse were to come by or a squirrel were to come by, that was going to be the end of it right there. And so they maintained vigilance of these things. The Pilgrims were committed people who were trustworthy. They were people who trusted in God and did not pride themselves in their own accomplishments. As we heard the 100th Psalm read today, that was the psalm that Governor Bradford read as the Pilgrims first took their step onto dry land. They gave the glory to God. As Calvinists and Reformed-type Christians, they were very attentive to God's will. They did not view suffering as only an unfortunate circumstance of God's wrath being poured out on them. While they did view suffering as part of God's sovereignty, the Pilgrims understood that suffering and unfortunate circumstances provide a particularly focused moment for repentance and for self-examination. While they were not able to discern God's express purpose in what was going on, they were just as clouded in their understanding as we are when we try to wonder, why do these bad things happen? They nevertheless used these moments still for good and reflected on how could they be more faithful to God and what do they need to be repentant of? What could be better in their lives to be of greater service to God? Now, what an opportunity would it be today in our nation if we would avail ourselves of the opportunities that suffering brings in our lives, that we would look inward instead of blaming God for everything that goes wrong or being bitter about the terrible things that happen. How much more beneficial would it be for each one of us to utilize these moments of adversity to look and examine the sinful self and to endeavor to live for something better? How much more fruitful would it be, instead of obsessing about what did I do that brought about this trial, or what didn't I do, or am I just caught up in the chaos of life in a broken world? That our mind thinks about these things and we obsess about them and go over them and all the time in our minds. Why is it the way it is? Why is my life so terrible? Why am I grieving? And of course, you're not going to not think of those questions. They're just part of the human experience. But what if we use those moments to focus on the good, to focus on the blessings of life, to think about how God has blessed you in ways that you cannot even articulate, how God has done something new in your life that would have never come about before you were awakened to see the preciousness of life, before you were awakened to see the depth of your sin. That with focusing on God in your moments of trouble, what would it be like for you in your life if you use those moments of trouble to look to the cross, to look to Christ, to remember his suffering, to remember how he endured all things for your sins? What would it be like for our country if we were to use this Thanksgiving holiday as a time of repentance, of turning back to God, of giving him our praise instead of living for ourselves? What would our government be like then? What would our relationships between people be then? How much more productive and peaceful would it be for you and for our nation as a whole to remember that in spite of all conflicts, to remember the words of Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that all things work together for them that love God, who are called according to his purpose.